Hey there, so this video is going to give you 5 signs you are not an ESFP. And unlike the other types I've covered so far in this series, it's got to be said that ESFP is not a common source of mistyping. Quite the reverse, in fact. Many people who consider themselves to be INFPs, INFJs, ENFPs, heck even some INTJs, may in fact have an ESFP cognition. And I do have good reason to suspect that ESFP cognition may even comprise the majority of mistyped INFJ communities. And as such, while the purpose of this video remains to help people determine whether or not they are truly an ESFP, it is also my hope people with an ESFP cognition mistyped as other types will also come to this video and hopefully take one step closer to finding their true cognitive type. Heck, maybe even you yourself may be an ESFP. So let us now dive into the first sign you are not an ESFP, starting with the difference between cognitive introversion and cognitive extraversion. Now, despite the fact that many ESFPs who enter this personality typing domain may be, for various reasons, a little bit shyer and more withdrawn than your noisy ESFP neighbour, they remain very much cognitively extroverted. Not every ESFP is going to be sociable and bouncing off the walls with their reckless abandon, and it is perfectly possible for an ESFP cognition to consistently receive an introverted score from an online test. However, the cognition of this type, what's going on beneath the surface, is very much more reactive than it is proactive. A reactive cognition tends to operate as an extension of an external interaction, whereas that more proactive nature is far more autonomous, engaged much more for its own sake, independent of any such external medium. Now, this is not to say that ESFP will experience an absence of the latter. We are all of us both introverted and extroverted after all. But assuming that the ESFP actually has things worth engaging with in the first place, they will tend to exhibit a greater sum of reactive cognition. And this could pertain as much to having a conversation with people as it could to going down a rabbit hole of research, acquiring a skill, engaging in a creative pursuit. External activity does not have to be sociable in order to be considered extroverted. And the habitat distinction, the space we are surrounded with, is a very important one, because even the most extroverted individual are going to have times where they have no choice but to turn their thought inward. Let's say you're waiting for a train and your phone's run out of battery. Well, what are you going to do? You can either strike up a conversation with the person who you don't know right next to you, or you can start engaging in an internal dialogue. And as such, the ESFP will find themselves more naturally engaged with an external conduit for their attention. It is not to say the ESFP lacks internal thought, but rather that much of the internal thought they do experience is more extensive of, contingent upon, external interaction. And as such, if you find yourself only ever going through short bursts of external interaction before your thoughts begin to turn inwardly, it is somewhat less likely you are an ESFP. Furthermore, if you find the bulk of your external interaction to be more of an extension of an internal dialogue, say from a more predictive center, it is less likely you are an ESFP. Furthermore, if you look at me right now in front of the camera, I'm not in a particularly extroverted state, but the extroversion I am displaying, this act of communication, is one whereby I am relaying introverted thinking information to you. My extroverted processes are acting as an extension of my introverted ones, rather than independently of an introverted center. The ESFP is very much a cognitive extrovert, and they do tend to feel a lot more harmonized with reality as a whole when they are engaged with an external pursuit. And just a reminder, these external pursuits do not have to be hyper-intense, all systems go, to be considered extroverted. Sign number 2 that you are not an ESFP. Extroverted sensing dominant function. So contrary to popular belief, extroverted sensing is not the aware of everything at once, bouncing off the walls function. In fact, the reason this function enjoys a particularly tangible experience of external reality is because it is not aware of everything at once. Now, let me explain. In a nutshell, one cannot be aware of absolutely everything going on around oneself and simultaneously enjoy a rich and tangible life experience. This is because in order to render an experience tangible in the first place, you must effectively lock onto it via an intense state of focus. As such, it is erroneous to equate a function known for tangible life experience with some kind of hyperspatial awareness. This is not to say extroverted sensing dominance lack to any degree spatial awareness, because after all, perceiving a lamppost, for example, as a tangible object is an effective countermeasure against walking headfirst into it. However, as far as macroscopic perception of external reality, that is, seeing everything at once, is concerned, that is much more the domain of the extroverted intuitive. Sure enough, extroverted intuitives do perceive reality in a much more abstract manner to that of the extroverted sensor, but it is the SE dominant who may lock in so intensely upon a single object or experience as to lose a sight of all others, or even the space in which this experience or object resides. And it is this very hyperfixation that renders reality tangible in the first place. And as such, if you find your attention scattered across everywhere, and yet unable to lock into anything specific, it is actually unlikely you are an SE dominant. The SE dominant experiences external reality in a very rich and intense manner, and the ESFP in particular often finds themselves with a very keen sense for aesthetic details that may go completely unnoticed by other types. And this does lend the type a certain artistic inclination, which is amplified by the type's natural desire for authentic self-expression. And if this rich, oftentimes aesthetic experience of tangible external reality is resonating with you, well, you may very well be an ESFP. But I would say, as an aside, it is unreliable to gauge a person's extroverted sensing position based upon their capacity for intense stimulation alone. Because while many ESFPs, I'd even say the majority of ESFPs, will tend to enjoy a higher capacity for prolonged bouts of intense external interaction than, say, some other types, this is not going to be the rule for every single ESFP. There are many different factors outside a personality type that can influence a person's tolerance for external stimuli. So yes, many ESFPs will be able to go to, say, a wild party and want to go to another one the next day, but this is not going to apply to every single person of this type. Which leads us neatly to sign number 3 that you are not an ESFP, the introverted feeling or authority function. The ESFP does not explore the external world for its own sake, but rather at the behest of individual identity. As such, contrary to popular belief, the ESFP does not pursue intense experiences for their own sake, or even as an escape from the confines of introverted dialogue, but rather much more often to serve as a bridge between external reality and one's authentic self. Indeed, the greatest drive for people of this type tends to be self-realization, and as such, authenticity does tend to be pretty high on an ESFP's list of priorities. Indeed, the ESFP tends to have the lowest tolerance for what might be considered inauthentic behavior, but conversely tends to have a lot of natural respect for those people who remain very much true to their own values in the face of adversity. And this natural valuing of authenticity is often more of a byproduct of the authoritative influence of introverted feeling within this type. While it is possible in some instances for the authority function to be subdued, it is relatively rare for an ESFP to transgress the boundaries set by their identity. For the ESFP, introverted feeling tends to act as the North Star to guide the excursions of the dominant functions. That being said, more divergent subtypes of the ESFP, which I do suspect to comprise many mistyped INFJs, for example, may lack the extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking, convergent, egoistic energies necessary to establish firm personal boundaries. Introverted feeling in these instances tends to remain highly divergent and thus observable, but can give way to a large degree of extroverted feeling subservience, and an introverted intuitive oppositional dialogue mistaken for actual introverted intuitive dominance. However, back to the introverted feeling authority, the ESFP is very much a creative idealist who ventures out into external reality, not just to express one's own individuality, but also to explore the inspirational energies that are necessary for the self-transformation this type so often craves. And this self-transformative agenda lends itself to the introverted intuitive lens to which introverted feeling in this type is assigned. Unlike convergent FI users, however, this NI-FI flux occurs within ESFP very much outside of the ego, and as such the type can be taken aback oftentimes by entirely unforeseen surges in inspiration and self-transformational energies. And it is not uncommon for the ESFP to go months or even years in search of this very inspiration, until suddenly they wake up one morning with a jolt of internal energies that effectively propel them towards the next step in their journey. However, this ability to be inspired in the first place can be a double-edged sword, as without the very inspiration they crave, self-motivation can be difficult for this type. If you find consistent, authentic self-expression to be, however desirable, more secondary to your psyche than it is a compulsive driving force, and even find yourself to make concessions in that area for the sake of, say, social harmony, or pragmatism even, it is somewhat unlikely you are an ESFP. Furthermore, if you find your inner self to be a static concept that tends to contract more than it expands, experiencing little transformational flux over the course of, say, 10 years, it is again unlikely you are an ESFP. The ESFP experiences not only a strong sense of individuality, but also the ever-expansion of what that individuality encompasses in the first place. The identity of the ESFP is often so expansive as to necessitate an archetype in order to both anchor it in place and to capture its totality in a way that can be effectively communicated. Sign number 4 that you are not an ESFP, the introverted intuitive oppositional function. For all but the most extroverted of ESFPs, it tends to exist a vast inner world, and this introverted intuition in oppositional position tends to be even more mysterious and otherworldly than that of the actual NI dominant. This is because whereas the NI of the INTJ and INFJ is ego-proximate and therefore much more consciously directed, that of the SE dominant is much more outside of the ego and consequently a much more altogether elusive experience. And whereas convergent introverted intuition tends to hone in on a single cohesive narrative, that introverted intuition which is more divergent, particularly here in oppositional position, tends to be far more expansive. And being paired with FI in the case of the ESFP, this function here tends to have a more naturally mysterious allure to it. As such, ESFPs tend to have a natural attunement to the expansive potential of existence, while the ego of the ESFP lends itself to what can be tangibly experienced. There lies under the veil of most ESFPs a sense of natural wonder at the magic of reality. It is this very sense of wonder that lends this type their oftentimes very natural sense of enthusiasm. Every moment has a capacity to be life-changing. Every burst of inspiration has great transformative power. And indeed, owing to the individualist agenda, the ESFP may oftentimes feel pressured and compelled to present themselves as much more an infinite source of enthusiasm and zest than they actually are, especially when you couple this with the natural valuing of an extroverted feeling atmosphere. As such, while NI processes here, much to the infuriation of this type, can be difficult to direct, the results of these processes tend to give the type a certain forward momentum. And this resulting NI compulsion can feel for this type akin to a pair of invisible hands on their back pushing them in a straightforward trajectory, whereby the type tends to be certain of a desired outcome, but uncertain of the means by which they arrived at that desire and the means by which the outcome can be achieved in the first place. And this tends to lend the ESFP a no-nonsense, just do it attitude. For with an inspired NI fueling their SETE, there tends to be very little that can stand in the way between this type and the person they want to become. As such, if you find your inspirations far less explosive in nature and find your interests to be scattered across reality in a much more disparate than singular and intense fashion, it is unlikely you are an ESFP. Furthermore, if you find yourself struggling much more with the action component taken upon meaningful inspiration than the actual generation of this inspiration in the first place, it is again unlikely you are an ESFP. As adept as the ESFP is at following the heart's desires, the inspiration necessary to fuel this very activity is often contingent upon tangible external experience, and as such does tend to be less internally generated than that of, say, the INFJ. And while not all ESFPs will conform to the action hero stereotype, nor even be particularly seeking of the spotlight in the first place, assertion of one's own individuality and values does tend to come a little bit easier for this type than, say, for others. And this very action orientation is complemented further by the extroverted thinking auxiliary of this type. Now, this externally analytical function is much less an ongoing constant within this type, and much more of an assistive tool, as the name auxiliary would very well imply, towards a more experiential, extroverted sensing dominant agenda. However, this more volitional than compulsive nature of this function gives it a high degree of fluidity and individuality, often manifesting as a highly individualized skill set or methodology, in perfect complement to, and very much acting at the behest of, the introverted feeling or authority of this type. When this type is sufficiently inspired as to fully activate this function, they may find themselves acquiring new skill sets both quickly and intuitively. Paired as it is, after all, to extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking within this type tends to focus into a much smaller portion of external reality than, say, that of the ENFP, and as such tends to lend this type a natural appreciation for nuance and sophistication. As such, the extroverted thinking of this type may be as drawn towards artistic and athletic pursuits as it may be towards anything requiring a finer attention to and appreciation for minute detail, such as microbiology, for example. So long as the field imparts sufficient bursts of intense experience, relying less upon, say, rote memorization for its own sake, the ESFP may find their natural attention to detail and flexible thinking style well suited to many different vocations. However, the caveat of this very extroverted thinking flexibility lies in its inconsistency. Much to the infuriation of both themselves and others, the ESFP may experience occasional lapses of reason, whereby extroverted thinking becomes much more delegated to the unconscious. And while this very unconscious delegation may yet further fuel this type's natural creativity, it can manifest itself in impulsive or even reckless behavior. Or in a more passive, and arguably more common sense, a tendency towards careless mistakes and, contrary to SE stereotypes, lapses in spatial awareness. And while we're on this topic, I do have to point out, while spatial awareness is very much a sum of many different functions, it is much more of a TE thing than it is an SE thing, which is why you may notice INTJs tend to report much higher levels of spatial awareness than the extroverted thinking blind INFJ. But I digress. The extroverted thinking of the ESFP is much more volitional than it is compulsive, requiring conscious activation. If you experience little flexibility in this area, finding conscious deliberate thought and analysis to be much more of an ongoing constant within your psyche, seldom giving way to a more intuitive external experience, it is again unlikely you are an ESFP. Furthermore, if you find yourself instead with a preference for TE efficiency, preferring to follow tutorials and learn things a tried and tested manner over finding your own individualized approach, it is again unlikely you are an ESFP. Bonus point, a tendency to rely upon introverted feeling processing, considered alongside the much more volitional nature of thinking as a whole within this type, tends to ensue an introverted thinking blind spot. Now, while it is true that many ESFPs will report a level of insecurity with a consciously directed internal thought process, especially around other people where the extroverted feeling side of the extroverted feeling introverted thinking axis is emphasized, there is yet a good reason why ESFPs often mistype as introverted thinkers such as the ESTP and indeed INFJ. While many ESFPs will be fully aware of their aversion to precise internal analysis, it is fair to say they do not rely completely 100% upon the more experiential deliberations of introverted feeling, introverted intuition either. ESFPs most certainly still think. However, such TI dialogue tends to be more of a subconscious hum within this type, and that introverted thinking which is more conscious tends to have an extroverted thinking origin point, such as an understanding of that which the ESFP is interacting with. That is to say, there is a good reason why ESFPs are so often fast on their feet and sound tacticians within their chosen field. There's also a good reason why they tend to acquire skills with such relative ease. For as long as the type can see the logical values in front of them, employing introverted thinking to both understand the mechanisms and innovate upon them, introverted thinking is far less of a blind spot within this type, as some type descriptions would make it out to be. However, when it comes to employing introverted thinking independently of such extroverted thinking application, the type may encounter significantly more resistance. The ESFP may yet find themselves coming to the correct conclusion, but when asked by others to, say, explain their reasoning, the ESFP may find themselves with a loss for words. And you can maybe now see why ESFPs tend to mistype as the more elusive, mystical and misunderstood INFJ. This TI insecurity, in conjunction with the mysterious allure of NI in oppositional position, can lead to an outright rejection of analytical thought and a greater attraction towards underdog theories that are by their very nature difficult to prove. And again, you may see now why there are many more ESFPs in the community than online personality test results may indicate. It is not that introverted thinking insecure variants of ESFPs are naive, you understand, but more that the relative blindness of this function, considered alongside the open-ended nature of NI in the oppositional position, does tend to manifest in a type more naturally open-minded than others. If you find vivid and precise internal analysis to come easily to you, and can easily trace back the steps that you took in order to come to your own logical conclusion, it is unlikely you are an ESFP. Furthermore, if you tend to struggle to keep an open mind, generally finding your logic to be more absolute and dismissive, it is again unlikely you are this type. So that concludes the video. I hope it's been useful, and I hope it's provided some additional insights into what I consider to be a highly underrated and misunderstood personality type. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to let me know by hitting the like button below, and if you know of anyone who you think might benefit from the content of the video, be sure to share it with them as well. If you are uncertain about your type or just like to know about how your type applies specifically to you as an individual, I do recommend checking out the CPT type service. And I also offer consultations and dedicated type coaching as well. And finally, if you are interested in supporting the channel and the theory on that additional level, I highly recommend checking out the Patreon page too. I do a live stream over there every month, and we also have our very own cozy little Patreon-only Discord server. So that is it for me, and I will be back in the fullness of time. For now, take care.